turn to Hebrews chapter 5. Hebrews chapter 5. That'll be the basis of our study here this evening. Hebrews chapter 5. Quickly, we're going to review the earlier part of the book of Hebrews on our outline, in chapter content, and then we'll get into chapter 5. The book of Hebrews divides down into two major sections. The first of those is that Christ is superior. The theme of the book, as we said, is that Christ is better or superior, depending on your translation. And so the point of the book is not only pointing that out, but that's really the main focus for the first half of the book. In chapter 1 through chapter 10 and in verse 18, it's driving home that emphasis that Christ is superior by drawing contrast and some comparisons. He's superior to the prophets in chapter 1, 1 to 3. He's superior to angels in chapter 1, verse 4 through chapter 2. He's superior to Moses in chapter 3. He offers superior rest in chapter 4, 1 to 13. Then at 4:14 through chapter 7, he offers a superior, or he is a superior priest. Brings a superior covenant, chapter 8. The first 14 verses of chapter 9, a superior sanctuary, and then he is a superior sacrifice, 9:15 through 10:18. It is then in chapter 10 and in verse 19 through the end of the book that he's talking about don't give up, there is no other way. And so chapter 10, the rest of it, keep the faith. Chapter 11, look to examples of faith. Chapter 12, endure in faith. And chapter 13, make application of faith. We've also been going over our chapter content. That is at the end of your material you have. The last page is chapter content. So far, we've covered the first 4 chapters. And so chapter 1 was about the fact that Christ is superior to prophets and angels. The first 3 verses dealing with the prophets. God at various times in various ways spoke in times past to the fathers by the prophets, hath in these last days spoken to us by his Son. And then as we pointed out, the rest of the chapter is always superior to angels, particularly focused in that chapter. He's superior to angels because he's divine. And so he's the Son of God, verse 5, verse 6, they're to worship him. While they, verse 7, they are ministers while he is the king on the throne and he's God. He's the creator. He's the one that's at the right hand of God while they are ministering spirits. And so that's the point he makes there, really focusing on the fact that he's divine. In chapter 2, Christ is superior to angels. We continue that thought, but this time it's argued because he's divine human. Chapter 1, he's divine. Chapter 2, he's human. But now human's a little lower than the angels, yes, but he's divine, and he took on flesh, and he suffered so we could be saved. He's divine, human. And so he's superior to angels. Chapter 3, he's superior to Moses, and then a warning, do not be disobedient. As we pointed out, the Hebrew writer, throughout a lot of this book, will give a sort of a doctrine section, if you will, and then he'll follow it up with, now here's a warning. So chapter 1 is an example. Christ is superior to angels. Here's the evidence of that. So the first part of chapter 2, take heed. We must give them more earnest heed lest we drift away, because the things spoken by angels prove steadfast. So how shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? If what the angels said that people were punished because they disobeyed, what about when we disobey the Son of God? Then chapter 2, the rest of chapter 2, about him being superior to angels. And the early part of 3, superior to Moses. And then at 7, beginning verse 7 of chapter 3, through the first part of chapter 4, he's pointing out to them there, you be careful not to be disobedient. Don't be like Israel. And so the rest of chapter 3, here they were disobedient. They didn't enter rest. So chapter 4, Christ offers a superior rest. We need to be careful lest we do not enter that rest. Chapter 4 is focused on. Chapter 4 then ends in verse 14 through 16 with this. Seeing then that we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weakness, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in the time of need. Christ was brought up already once before the end of chapter 4 as high priest at the beginning of chapter 3. Therefore, holy brethren, partakers of the heavenly calling, consider the apostle and high priest of our confession, Christ Jesus. But then at the end of chapter 4, after talking about this rest through the first 13 verses, he points out that we have a great high priest who passed through the heavens. We have a sympathizing high priest who was in all points tempted as we are. Therefore, verse 16, we can come boldly to the throne of grace and we can find mercy to help in the time of need. And so he then at that point begins a shift in verse 14 to dealing with that section that we saw going back to our outline on Christ being superior. It's at the end of chapter 4, he shifts to this point here, that he offers a superior priesthood, or he's a superior priest. He introduced that at the end of chapter 4, but now we're in chapter 5. That's what chapter 5 is focused on. Chapter 5, or the end of 4, most of chapter 5, and chapter 7 is focused on the priesthood. Now, you look at the outline, we group 6 in there with it. 6 is the end of 5, and then chapter 6 is, if you will, a sort of a parenthetical. And so, I'm talking about that here in a second when we summarize chapter 5, but he's got to take a pause from the priesthood to deal with something else to come back to the priesthood. But we group that all together here for simplicity's sake. Now, if you'll have your books with you, let's do some of our questions. Question number 1. Briefly summarize the chapter. So what's chapter 5 about? Two things. One of them's on the board. Christ is superior high priest. What's the second part of the chapter about that causes us to have to step away from this discussion of his priesthood? If you look at your outline, point number 3, they have a lack of maturity. And because of their lack of maturity, spiritually, we're going to have to take a pause now. And we're going to have to deal with the immaturity at the end of 5 and into 6 before we can come back to the priesthood. We'll talk about that more when we get there in just a second. But we got to go back to the foundation because they have problems with the foundational principle. So the writer here, we got to go back to that. Now that we've gone back and sort of reestablished, let's move on. Let's move past that, chapter 6. So he has to take a pause from discussion of the priesthood because of their immaturity. Again, we're going to skip down to question 4. We'll come back at 2 and 3 as we get to them. But we're going to skip to question 4. I should have made this the second question, all of them. List the Old Testament passages quoted in this chapter. There are 2 quotations. Now, I'm going to say this again. I'm going to come to in a minute and say here may be an allusion to this passage. That's not what we're talking about. There are several Old Testament passages alluded to, but we're talking about direct quotations. There's 2 of them. What are they? The first one is verse number 5. You are my son, and I have begotten you. That's Psalm 2, verse 7. It was quoted already once in this book, back in chapter 1. We'll talk about what that means more in a minute. But Psalm 2:7, and then verse number 6. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. That's Psalm 110. And then verse 4. Again, Psalm 110 has been quoted already. Earlier in the book. Psalm 110 was quoted from. Most of the time it's quoted or alluded to, as we'll see throughout the book, is verse 1. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. But here he quotes from verse 4, talking about the priesthood of Christ and paralleling that to the priesthood of Melchizedek. Now, as we begin in chapter 5, the key verse, I think, is verse 10. Could also be verse 6. But verse 10 is how we have it, is what we have here. Now, both of those emphasize the main point. He is called by God as a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. Now, again, we're going to come back to Melchizedek in a minute. We got to establish, there's some things he establishes with the audience before he brings Melchizedek into the discussion of priesthood. But this is our key verse, and we'll talk again more about him in a minute, and then we'll see more, Lord willing, and perhaps next Wednesday when we get to chapter 7 and look at what is said there about Melchizedek. The chapter here divides itself down into three major sections. The first of those is the qualifications of a high priest. Now, 1 to 4 is not focused on the qualifications of Christ as high priest in terms of, well, this is why he's qualified to be high priest. We're going to get to that in verse number 5. But what 1 to 4 is this is the qualifications of the high priest in general. You go back to the old law and you look at the high priest, and here was the qualifications of a high priest. So, what are they? Let's look at verse 1 beginning. For every high priest taken from among men is appointed for men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sin. He can have compassion on those who are ignorant and going astray, since he himself is also subject to weakness. Because of this, he is required, as for the people, so also for himself, to offer sacrifice for sins. And no man takes this honor to himself, but he was called by God just as Aaron was. So, there are 5 qualifications given of a high priest here. The first of those, pointed out in verse 1a, is that a high priest is from among men. Now, go to Exodus 28:1. Keep your marker here, your finger here in Hebrews. Look at Exodus chapter 28. Exodus 28 is when we have the establishment of the Levitical priesthood through the line of Aaron. And here's what is said in verse 1. Now take Aaron your brother and his sons with him from among the children of Israel. So, Aaron and his sons, they are among the people. Take them from among the people. And they're appointed to serve as high priest. So the first of those is they're from among men. Now, again, we're going to come back in a minute, and we're going to emphasize the fact that Christ meets the qualifications to be a high priest, and then he goes beyond that, if you will. Here are the qualifications of the high priest. Christ meets those, and then Christ exceeds those. And we'll talk about that more in a second. So we'll come back and draw that parallel. But right now we're focused on the Levitical priesthood. So, he's high priest. He's taken from among men. Secondly, he is appointed for men in things pertaining to God. So he's acting for men pertaining to God. That is, you go back to what they were, the Levitical priesthood responsibilities were. They were going in to offer sacrifice and these other things, which we'll get to it again in verse 1 and 3 in a minute. But they're acting on the behalf of who? The behalf of men. They're acting on the behalf of the children of Israel in this case. The Levitical priesthood is acting on the behalf of the children of Israel in things pertaining to God, offering of the sacrifices and these. So it has to do with the spiritual things pertaining to God. They're acting on the behalf of men. Look again, verse 1. Into verse 1. That he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. Verse 3. Because of this, he is required, as for the people, so also for himself, to offer sacrifices for sin. So, as we look at this here, verse 1, the end of verse 1, he may offer both gifts and sacrifices. Now, there's a distinction drawn between gifts and sacrifices. What exactly is that? Well, perhaps what the point is being made, if you go back to, and we have recorded for us the old law where we can read about the responsibilities of the high priest, perhaps they all were, in a sense, the sacrifices, but the gifts may have to do with the non-blood sacrifices, like the grain offerings, and then sacrifices may be representing the offerings that required a shedding of blood. We don't know the specifics, but knowing what we know about the qualifications of priests and what their responsibilities were under the old law, that seems to fit here with the idea of gifts and sacrifices. But the point is, they're offering things on the behalf of men to God. They're acting on. So again, they're from among men. They're acting for men in things pertaining to God. They offer gifts and sacrifices. Now, let's go again to verse 3. Here's how I know that this is not only talking about Christ. Does Christ meet the qualifications of a high priest? Yes, he does. But how do I know he's not only talking about Christ? Look at verse 3. Because of this, he is required, as for the people, so also for himself, to offer sacrifices for what? Sins. So Christ didn't sin. He offered a sacrifice, but as Paul would point out in the book of 2 Corinthians, the sacrifice was not on his behalf. He made him who knew no sin to be sin. Right? He took on the punishment of sin, not for himself, but for us. So that's how I know in this that it's not simply talking about the priesthood of Christ, though we're drawing and building to that conclusion, but how it is including the Levitical priesthood, because Christ did not have to offer a sacrifice for himself. Now let's go back now to verse 2 and 3. What's the qualification of a high priest? He can be compassionate. Now, does that mean every high priest is always what they need to be compassionate? No. The point is, he's compassionate in the sense that he can understand what it means to be man. Look at verse 2. He can have compassion on those who are ignorant and going astray, since he himself is also subject to weakness. So you take a priest like Aaron as a high priest. Did Aaron ever sin? Well, go throughout whether it's speaking against Moses, whether it's the making of the golden calf back in Exodus 20. By the way, we may forget this sometimes. Moses is told not to enter in because he struck the rock, but guess who was right there with him and was punished too? Aaron. So the point is, was Aaron perfect? No. He could understand and be compassionate because he understood what it was, because he was subject to weakness too. Now, number 4. This may be the one where they may argue the most against Christ here in a minute. A priest is called by God. And no man takes this honor to himself, but he was called by God just as Aaron was. Now, obviously there are those who tried to make themselves priests under the old law, but in terms of truly being the high priest for God, that was given or appointed by God. Aaron was first appointed, and then it was through his line that was to continue. So whether it was Eleazar or on down the line, through that lineage of Aaron, here they were called by God. It was going to be the family. It was going to be through the line of Levi, through the family of Aaron. They're to be the priest and the high priest. They're not appointing themselves. Again, if you go back to Exodus 28 and in verse 1, we referenced it earlier and looked at the beginning. In Exodus 28 and in verse 1, now take Aaron, your brother, and his sons with him from among the children of Israel, that he may minister to me as a priest. That's God who said that. The children of Israel didn't hold an election and decide who to elect as a high priest. Aaron and his sons didn't just say, you know what, we're going to take the jobs of being priests. They were called by God to serve as high priest. He's called the family of Aaron. He appointed the qualification here to serve as the high priest. They then serve as high priests. Now, the point that we're building to, and that's going to be driven, is that Christ meets the qualifications of a high priest. Now, he is God, but he took on the form of flesh or man. So he comes from among men. Does he act when it comes to things pertaining to God? Yes. Does he offer gifts and sacrifices? Well, he offered the sacrifice of himself that we're going to get to more later on. Does he understand what it is to be tempted? Right? Aaron could understand what it is to be subject to weakness. Now, Christ didn't sin, but he understands what it's like to be tempted. That's the point made at the end of chapter 4. He was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. So can he meet that of being compassionate because he understands? The answer is yes. Now, perhaps where the Hebrew Christians might have their most pushback is on this. But is he called by God? That is, maybe their argument is, well, he's a high priest, but he made himself high priest. That could be an argument that they may be trying to make, and so they're going to try to push back on that, well, he's not called by God like these others were.
I think I read when I was doing some studies that Melchizedek, was he not where the Sadducees eventually came from? Was it not his house that they came out of?
Melchizedek was from a different, I don't know if the Sadducees all came through that. Melchizedek was not at least from the same line as Abraham, where the Sadducees would have been the Jewish people. Melchizedek, we don't know anything about him besides he served as priest. And that's the point that the Hebrew writer is going to point back to in chapter 7. He's without father and mother. Not that he didn't have a father and mother, but we don't, Melchizedek just sort of appeared onto the scene, and as quickly as Melchizedek appeared, he sort of vanished, and there was no successor to his line as priest. So, I'm not sure exactly on your question on the Sadducees where they came from. They were Jewish people, so that would be somewhere through the line of Abraham. Melchizedek and Abraham were not from the same line, so it would be...
But Melchizedek was from the tribe of Levi, right? He was a Levite?
No, because he was during the days of Abraham. So he was before, and that's a point that's going to be made later on, that he's superior to Levi because Abraham paid homage to Melchizedek, of whom Levi was in his loins, and so in a sense Levi paid homage to Melchizedek. And so the argument that's made later on in chapter 7 is Melchizedek is superior to Abraham. Thus, if Melchizedek is superior to Abraham, and Abraham's child is Levi, then Melchizedek's priesthood is better than the Levitical priesthood. That's why Christ is from the order of Melchizedek. His priesthood, like Melchizedek, and we'll come to this here in a second, meets some certain things that are in line with the priesthood of Melchizedek, who just sort of appeared on the scene and sort of disappeared. And so he's from the line in that Melchizedek was a king and a priest, and Christ is king and priest. Melchizedek was without father or mother, and that is, it wasn't like those of the tribe of Levi, inherited the priesthood. Eleazar became priest because he was the son of Aaron. He was next in line for the high priest. Melchizedek's priesthood was superior to that of Aaron, chapter 7, or the Levitical priesthood, and that's what's argued there, that Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek. And so Levi, being a descendant of Abraham, is thus, and his priesthood and the priesthood through Aaron is inferior to that. And he was a one high priesthood. He was king and priest over all. I'll have a chart on that in a minute. Christ was priest over all versus the Levitical priesthood is different. So he was a priest called by God, but long before the Levitical priesthood's ever established. Because we're going all the way back to Genesis 14. When Abraham rescues Lot from being carried off in Genesis 14, on his way back is when Abraham meets Melchizedek, which is where he pops onto the scene. He's not mentioned again until Psalm 110:4, and then he's not mentioned again until here in Hebrews. So he was well before the time of Levi, and so that's why we don't know really anything about his origin, because he's long before. He was not from the line of Abraham. He was during the time of Abraham, and we'll come to that here more in just a second. So back here to the qualifications of Christ. Again, he's from among men. He took on the form of flesh or man. He acts on the behalf of man pertaining to God. He offered himself as a sacrifice. He's been tempted as we are, yet without sin, so he has the compassion to know what it's like. So 5 to 10, Christ is the perfect high priest. So here's the point that's made in verse 5, verse 6, and again in verse 10. He is appointed a priest by God. Again, perhaps that's where the Jews push back. As you go to the qualifications, and Paul says, those that serve, or Paul, or whoever the writer is, says, the qualifications of a high priest under the Levitical priesthood is this. And he gives all those qualifications. They'd be sitting there saying, amen to all of those. And then he says, but then they may be sitting there going, but what about Christ? Is he a priest along those qualifications? And then they may look at some of them, and he's going to come back to them and say, yeah, he meets those qualifications, and then he supersedes those qualifications of a priest. But again, the biggest pushback that perhaps the Hebrew Christians would have had is, but he's not appointed by God, he made himself high priest. And here's the point the Hebrew writer makes, verse 5 and 6. So also Christ did not glorify himself to become high priest. But it was he who said to him, you are my son, today I have begotten you. As he also says in another place, you are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. There are two quotations from the Old Testament. Verse 10 has a partial quotation as well from Psalm 110, verse 4. But our two quotations we have noted here are those two. So here's the point, and we can go back to chapter 1. To which of the angels did he ever say, you are my son, today I have begotten you? That was used to argue that Jesus is superior to the angels, right? Because he's the Son of God. Which is we pointed out before, this passage is talking about the resurrection. How do we know that? Paul said that in Acts 13:33. That Christ is raised from the dead, of which the psalmist spoke in the second psalm, and he quotes this verse, which has reference to the resurrection. So the one that said, "You're my son, today I've begotten you," telling of the resurrection of Christ, is the one that also said, "You are the priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." It's not Christ saying, "I'm priest." The point is, the Father said, "You are my son," and the same Father that said, "You're my son," is the one who said what? "You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." Christ wasn't the one that made that statement. Verse 10. Called by God as high priest, according to the order of Melchizedek. So is Christ high priest? Well, he was called or appointed by God. He didn't make himself high priest. The Father made him high priest. He then, verse 7, had days in the flesh, who in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with vehement cries and tears to himself, who was able to save him from death and was heard because of his godly fear. So he had days in the flesh. Now again, why is it important that he had days in the days of his flesh, or he had days in the flesh? Go back to verse 1. For every high priest taken from where? Among men. Christ had his days in the flesh. Did he meet the qualification of coming from among men? Well, in the sense that he took on flesh. Now let's look at a couple of things here in verse 7 before we move to verse 8 and 9. He offered up prayers and supplications with vehement cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death. Church, because of his godly fear. We can go back and look at Christ in the garden and the prayers that he's offering there. If possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. He offered up these prayers to God with vehement cries and tears. He knew what he was going to suffer. And he offered those prayers to God, and he was heard. Why? Because of his godly fear. Some have tried to argue that the fear here at the end is his fear of death. No, it's talking about godly fear. And at the point, when we talk about godly fear, he had reverence and respect for God. Why does the Son go to the Father in prayer, asking that this pass from him? Well, the Father is the one to whom to go to in prayer. He's the one in control, and it was his will, and that's why he makes the statement, nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. He submitted to the will of the Father in suffering death. Verse 8 now, verse 8 and 9, he suffered death. Now, that again is important. We'll come back to this more in chapter 9 and 10, because he didn't just suffer death, but he suffered death to be the sacrifice for sins. So he offered a sacrifice. Though he was a son, yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. And having been perfected, he became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him. He's a son, yet he learned obedience through the things that he suffered. He submitted to the Father's will. Again, not my will, but thine be done. And obeyed the Father's will in submitting himself to that and giving himself on the cross there as he suffers. Having been perfected. Now, I don't think the point of being perfected, the point's not that he's perfect. And that's true that he's perfect. He didn't sin, chapter 4. But the word perfected really has the idea of complete. Having them been complete. He completed the purpose for which he came. He completed the old law. Having done all that, he became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him. Now, it's translated in some translations, like the New King James here, by the word author. And when we think of an author, we think of a person that writes a book. You say you're going to meet an author, you're thinking, well, you're going to meet a person that wrote some book. He's the author of eternal salvation. But now, think about it this way with author. The author didn't write a story. The author is what? The creator or the source of whatever it is they're writing. The word here, according to BDAG, a lexicographer, means pertaining to being the cause of something. And so, the English Standard Version then would use the translation, would translate it, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. He's the source of salvation. He's why we can have salvation. It's through Christ. Verse 10 again, called by God as a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. Now, let's take the priesthoods again. There are qualifications to serve as a high priest. Right? Taken from among men, act on the behalf of men in things pertaining to God, offer gifts and sacrifices, compassionate, and called by God. Does Christ meet all of those qualifications? Yes. But he doesn't just meet them. Here he is, he's the Son of God who took on flesh and didn't just offer sacrifices, offered himself as the sacrifice for sin. Here's why this is important. Christ doesn't meet but supersedes the qualification. If Christ just met the qualifications to be the high priest, just like those under the Old Testament, then guess what? There's no need to turn to him because he's not, as priest, because he's not a superior high priest. It would be a lateral move, if you will. If he met the qualification, that was it. But he's a superior priest because, again, he is priest according to the order of Melchizedek. Now, again, here's the chart we mentioned earlier. There's more than this involved in the priesthood of Melchizedek. We'll come back to some of that in chapter 7 when we talk more about it. But again, he was without father and mother. We don't know where he came from. Obviously, he had father and mother, but we don't know where he came from. He was just sort of appeared on the scene and disappeared. He was priest and king. The book of Zechariah would point out that Christ is going to be king, that he would be priest on his throne. So he's priest and king. Again, it's a superior priesthood to the Levitical priesthood, which we've got to get more to in chapter 7. And then it was a one high priesthood in that Melchizedek was priest. Do we know anybody that succeeded Melchizedek as priest? Do we know anybody that preceded Melchizedek in this role of high priest? It was a one priesthood. So, Melchizedek, he was priest over all. He was God's high priest according to the book of Genesis, which again we'll go back to more later on when we get to chapter 7. Then we have Aaron. Aaron is high priest over who? The Jews. And so in terms of the census, he's high priest. Is there a priest over the Gentiles? No, not in the sense as Aaron is. So Melchizedek is priest over all. Aaron is over the Jews, not over the Gentiles. But Jesus is high priest over all. So he's priest and king. He's priest over all. He was a one priesthood. He had no predecessor. He has no successor. And all of that. Christ is a priest according to the order of Melchizedek. Now then in verse 11, here's what is said. Of whom we have much to say and hard to explain, since you've become dull of hearing. Well, at this point, as you build throughout the book of Hebrews and the arguments that are being made, this is where the Hebrew writer's wanting to say, now, we've got to talk about Melchizedek and why it is that he's a priest according to the order of Melchizedek and why that's superior to the Levitical priesthood. But then in verse 11, he's really saying, but we've got to wait because they've become dull of hearing. They've become sluggish of hearing. That word dull is actually translated sluggish and used in a different sense, but the same word as sluggish in chapter 6. Because they've become dull or slow in their hearing. Wasn't a physical hearing problem. The problem is because of their immaturity, they were not understanding and applying as they needed to. For though by this time, verse 12, you ought to be teachers. You need someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God, and you've come to need milk and not solid food. For everyone who partakes only of milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. But solid food belongs to those who are full age. That is, those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. A couple of things we learn in this text is the Hebrew writer's rebuke here. One, there comes a time where we must go on to be mature. In verse 6, or in chapter 6, he's going to use the phrase, let us go on to perfection. Again, that word perfection has the idea of let us go on to be complete or mature. And so there comes a time where we move on to maturity. The problem is not the milk. The problem is they need to have moved past the milk. There are some who need the milk, and there's not a problem with that. Somebody that's a new convert, when they come fresh out of the waters of baptism, they are spiritually immature and they have to grow. What do they need? They need the milk of the Word. Just like in a child, you give a child milk to grow. Using the comparison between the two girls, Gracie's still a long way, well, not a long way from solid foods. She's going to start some of those baby food soon, but in terms of you can't put, a piece of chicken in front of her or something like that. She needs milk. Now, Katie's at the age now where she can eat the solid food. Milk is not enough at that age. And as you get older, milk is still not enough to sustain us. We've got to have the solid food. Spiritually speaking, that's the problem. If somebody comes out of the waters of baptism, we shouldn't ask them to preach a full-on sermon and explain the book of Revelation. Right? That's some solid food. They need some milk. But somebody that's been a Christian for quite a while, they need to move past the milk to the solid food. Now, let me say this. That doesn't mean that we ever forget the milk, because even as you grow older, you may still drink some milk, but you're not sustained by that. They've got to move past the solid food. We still need those first principles, but we've got to move past to where we can go not just first principles, but beyond, and that's the problem. They were unskilled in the word of righteousness. They weren't as familiar with it as they needed to be. In fact, some of their problems that we're dealing with in Christ are answered by first principle things. Christ and who He is and what He's done. That's first principle stuff. They needed to go back to that to be reminded. One more thing real quick, verse 14. By reason of use has their senses exercised. You know how you exercise your senses spiritually? You use them. You use them. And so we study God's Word. We spend time in prayer. We make application. We're using our senses. And then we can grow. But if we're not doing that, then like those here that the Hebrew writer is writing to, our senses aren't exercised. We're not able to discern good and evil. We've got to go back to milk and work our way back up to solid food. Lord willing, on Sunday morning, we'll do chapter 6, which again is sort of a parenthetical. The end of 5 and into chapter 6, sort of a parenthetical. We've got to take a break now and deal with your immaturity. And then in chapter 7, we come back to the priesthood of Melchizedek.
Every tear,